guests. Good evening. My name is Lisa Meeks, and I serve as the principal investigator in the Dream Lab. And I'm also the founder and co-director of the Docs with Disabilities Initiative. And it is, as always, my privilege to welcome you to Dream Research Rounds, but also especially this evening, where we're welcoming you to the inaugural Jack Ruddell Memorial Talk. This annual lecture is dedicated to honoring the life and the legacy of Jack Ruddell, a beloved son, a friend, an emerging physician. Through this talk, we aim to not only remember and celebrate Jack, but also to spotlight the research, the resources, and the innovations related to suicide prevention and mental health and medical education that Jack himself would have championed. In remembering Jack, we also recognize the too often hidden toll of medical training, the weight of depression, suicidality, and systemic barriers that affect far too many learners. So, starting this year and each year after, we will spotlight research, resources, and innovations as we honor Jack's legacy, but also strengthen our shared commitment to making medical education a place where every learner can thrive. And for this special event, we are very deeply honored to be joined by John and Jennifer Ruddell, Jack's parents, with amazing curiosity, generosity, courage, and kindness. They have chosen over the last several years to share Jack's story with both me and with our community so that his life inspires change, fosters dialogue, and strengthens our commitment to creating a more compassionate and supportive culture in medicine. And their presence today, I think, really serves as a reminder that behind every loss, behind every student, behind every statistic, there is a family. Jack was a beloved son. There are also daughters and colleagues and friends. Please welcome John and Jennifer Ruddell.
Oh,
Thank you, Lisa.
yes, thank you so much, Lisa, for providing this important platform and the opportunity to learn together and communicate about these critical issues. By honoring our son through this annual memorial talk, you're helping our family to carry our Jack forward in an incredibly meaningful way, giving voice to a call for positive change in the culture and curricula of medical training. Yet, we also recognize that the change has not come just yet. The conversations are happening, awareness is growing, but the meaningful shift that we and so many others are hoping for is still urgently needed. As parents, it's important for us to advocate for change, to put uncomfortable topics on the table, and to help normalize them. This conversation feels especially timely. As yesterday marked the National Physician Suicide Awareness Day, and we are approaching the 5-year anniversary of our son's death, we carry deeply this great loss, and we miss Jack every day. We could not be prouder, though, of our Dr. Jack Ruddell and the person that he was. Although difficult to capture in just a few words, Jack was joyful, accomplished, an incredible son, a brother and friend, and most importantly, at his core, he was known for his kindness, his compassion and empathy towards others, whether lifelong friends or those he had just met. While he had many interests, over time he developed a passion for medicine and for becoming a doctor. The passion for medicine was matched by his instinct to connect deeply with patients and families. It was the human side of doctoring. So we are truly grateful that Jack's compassion and spirit will live on through this memorial talk, helping to inspire and remind us all of the ongoing need for a culture of care and wellness in medical education.
It's now my great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. For this inaugural talk on suicide and suicide prevention among medical learners, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Justin Bullock presenting. Dr. Bullock is an assistant professor of nephrology at the University of Washington School of Medicine and co-director of the Docs with Disabilities Initiative. His primary research focuses on how educators can foster identity safety in the learning environment, creating spaces where all members of the healthcare team can be their authentic selves in the spirit of healing. He's a passionate medical educator, teacher, researcher, and lifelong learner. We first connected with him through his participation in our podcast series, co-produced with Docs with Disabilities. And we're deeply appreciative that he has taken the time to be with us today. In addition to his education scholarship, Dr. Bullock is outspoken about his lived experience as a Black bipolar physician, sharing his dual identities as both a patient with a serious illness and as a provider of care for others. He believes deeply that medicine is a lifelong journey of healing for providers as much as for patients. Justin, it's an honor to welcome you to the inaugural Jack Ruddell Memorial Talk. Thank you for joining us and for helping us advance this vital dialogue on suicide prevention and wellness in medical education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruddell. I'm going to pull up my slides. But first, I guess, as I'm doing that, just want to share that, today I've been, today is a very emotional day for me. I feel incredibly honored and grateful to get to be with you all. As we were preparing for this talk, I had the opportunity to meet Mr. and Mrs. Ruddell and get to talk with them. And as I was talking, I was sort of bringing up that a bit of a fear that I wanted to do my best to try and honor Jack. Ruddell said something to me that really hit me very hard, which was that they wanted me to tell my story and to show up as myself. And as you can see, I'm wearing a little bit of casual gear. This is a Seattle Husky. They used to live in Seattle. That's where I currently live. This is Justin in his authentic self. And so I decided to wear the clothing that matched who I am. I'm going to share with you all a paper, really two papers that really mean a lot to me. Hopefully my slides will fast forward. Okay, so today I wanted to, and I didn't say this, as someone who didn't know Jack personally, I felt that I had a very beautiful opportunity to get to know some of who he was through participating in the Docs with Disabilities series. And it's an amazing series, and I really encourage people to listen to it if you haven't had the opportunity to do so. Today I'm going to be talking about a paper which I wrote with one of my sort of work best friends, Hannah Anderson, Dr. Hannah Anderson. It's called The Forest and the Trees, Theorizing a Culturally Sustaining Pedagogy for Medical Education. This was just recently published in Social Science and Medicine. And as you'll see, we'll weave through medical education and finish with sort of a deep dive talking about mental health and mental illness. I want to say I have no financial disclosures. The one thing, and I want to acknowledge as me being my authentic self, is we can grieve and be sad and we can celebrate and have beautiful things. So my co-author on this paper and the person who really led this project, Dr. Hannah Anderson, defended her PhD thesis today. And for me, this is an incredible accomplishment, extremely happy, joyous moment. So, normally I may call her Hannah, but today I will take every opportunity to call her Dr. Anderson as we go. And the last to say is I will talk about topics related to mental illness and suicidality. I try really hard to be intentional about what I share around suicidality as to not sort of just overly traumatized for no reason. And I really try to share the details that for me feel the most important to the story and to making the point that I hope to make. So the human being is a storytelling being. We make sense of the world through the stories that we tell. Stories literally can and do change lives. As a medical education researcher who leans quite heavily qualitative, I believe that there is so much beauty and power in understanding stories. And it's in this spirit that we use a method called story cycling to explore this idea of culturally sustaining pedagogy, which I'll talk about what it means. Story cycling is it is a methodology which leverages a lot of the sort of innate human capabilities around stories, but uses it and leverages it in an academic way. So it is a process of reflecting to find stories, sharing stories. I mentioned I wrote this paper with someone who I care very deeply about, sharing very intimate, often sometimes intense stories. This process of sort of taking a step back and discussing and analyzing it, sometimes as if you were not a person who was participating in the story, and also holding the lens of as a person who was in the story, and repeating this cycle over and over. And thus, with each turn, the conversations are abstracted, refined, and reconstructed to create a rich, overarching understanding of lived, personal, familiar, and ancestral experiences. So as we did this story cycling, we posed a few questions through our storying. I begin with the method before I get into the details of the story, because the stories came quite organically through just conversation and deep dialogue with a person with whom I felt very safe. In the first story cycle, we asked this question: what is the hidden implicit purpose of medical education? In story cycle number 2, we asked, why does medical education sustain this purpose? And in story cycle number 3, we asked, what might be an otherwise purpose for medical education? These questions may not mean much to you now, but hopefully as we go, they will make more sense. I want to begin with a story that Dr. Anderson told me about ceiba trees. Ceiba trees are trees that are native to South America. They're known across the world for being these big, beautiful trees that have these amazing large canopies, that there are entire ecosystems who are dependent upon the ceiba trees for their survival. When settlers arrived to South America, they too marveled at the ceiba trees, at how big they were, at how powerful their canopies were. But they too wanted the land. So they brought their axes and their shovels. And they began to clear the forest, cut down the trees, cut down many ceiba trees. Sometimes, because they thought they were so beautiful, they would dig them up and move them to a new location. And as the story goes, isolated from the forest that it came from, strange things could happen to the ceiba trees. Sometimes the ceiba tree would wither in a strange new climate. Sometimes it would grow all alone in a new field, but isolated, it would falter. Its branches would grow short, and no matter how hard it tried, it could not grow a canopy. And sometimes a lone ceiba tree survived and pushed to thrive, its branches defiantly spreading over barren fields, a rebuke, a testament, still providing much needed shelter and sustenance to all. When many people in medical education, or many people in general, hear this story, Oftentimes we focus on the lone sea that survived, how strong it is, how powerful for overcoming all these very challenging odds. But often what we miss, similar to what we miss in medical education, is the damage, the barren fields, all the saber trees that we lost in the process. And instead, we focus on the few beautiful, shining examples of overcoming. Um, and in this way, we actually lose so much. We use the story of saber trees to make the point that medical education is a model of extraction. When we say extraction, we mean two things. One, physical separation of the intellectual elite. So, medical education, it takes the best and the brightest. You must survive a treacherous journey through, high school, through college. Some people do post-bacs or other work, and they are physically placed into medicine, oftentimes in places that are far from where they grew up, away from their families. As you go through medical training, you have such intense work hours that you're effectively isolated from the communities and people who supported you on the path to getting to medicine. And in addition to being physically separated, you are forcibly socialized into the norms of medicine. If you do not acquiesce to, being a doctor or nurse or other health professional, as others have defined it, you're not allowed to advance. You're pushed out of medicine, etc. And so extraction is this combined process of separation and socialization. And extraction is incredibly common in medical education, and it's also incredibly devastating. We propose sustaining as the pedagogical alternative to extraction. What that means is, as opposed to an education system which prioritizes separating the intellectual elite and socialize them into the norms of medicine, sustaining refers to ways that we draw on people's rich histories, cultures, communities that they come from, and we actually encourage them to remain in contact with those communities and in contact with those identities and cultures, and that those things help people to thrive, to not only survive, but to thrive. Culturally sustaining pedagogy, CSP, is this philosophic paradigm. It imagines how education, instead of an education where, in primary education, for instance, you come in and, your teacher may say, don't use slang, don't speak like that. You should speak proper English because proper English is what you need to make it in society. What happens is people lose the way that they communicate with their communities, and instead are socialized into the norms. And CSP asks, how can we support a multicultural, multilingual, pluralistic society? Just to draw on that language point just a bit more, um, CSP would critique, for instance, the way that medical education teaches people how to speak like a doctor. So, as a clinician, if I said, this person has a fever, I think they have a kidney infection, and I think their white blood cell count is high, I would be rebuked or I would be criticized. Instead, I should say this person is febrile, has a leukocytosis with, costovertebral angle tenderness. I think they have pyelonephritis. And while it's important to have a shared language, for which we communicate with each other, what actually ends up happening is people lose their ability to speak normal English. They lose their ability to explain things to patients in non-technical language. And it's because as we're in medical education, we force a single, unified, only way of talking, and that's the only tolerated language that exists in the hospital. And so there are consequences when we extract people and do not sustain who they were. I always say, the most bilingual or fluent person in the hospital, at least in medical training, is the fourth year medical student, because they still hold on to their ability to communicate with people in non-technical language and simultaneously are versed or able to speak in the medical technical language. But as people go through time, they actually lose this ability. So I have some stories that we used as we were exploring this concept of CSP and what CSP for medical education could look like. So first story, I love being a doctor, but at what cost? I wonder if anyone knows where this statue is. And I actually don't even know if I can see the chat. But this is a statue in Detroit. It's called the Spirit of Detroit. I grew up in Detroit. I grew up in the 90s and 2000s in a time where my community was very Black. The teachers were Black, the police officers were Black, the good guys were Black, the bad guys were Black, everyone around me was Black. Um, and um, and despite and you know as I have since moved from Detroit, you know, as I talk to many people, they'll often ask me, oh, like how was it growing up in Detroit? Kind of asking as if it was this like very kind of scary or bad experience. But for me, it was actually an incredibly amazing experience because I saw people who shared my identity in many different contexts. Um, and but when I got to medical school, um, I moved contexts. I moved to a place that did not have many Black people, and I was very aware that where others were very conscious of my Blackness. After I was pulled over by the police 3 times within the first 6 months of living there, and each time I was riding my bike. Um, and I didn't know anyone else who had had similar experiences to me. As I went through medical training, we learned about things like adverse childhood experiences or ACEs. And, ACEs are linked to every negative health outcome that exists. And in studies where they categorize ACEs, there's usually 1, 2, 3, 4 or more, or 4 or more. And I was someone who had 7 ACEs. Of the 7 original that were described, I had all 7. Um, and somehow, despite that, I had made it out. I had survived and thrived. And it's because I was existing in a community where people really lifted people like me up. A prime example of this is as I was in college one year, I went back and I was running track in college, and I was running one winter day. As I'm driving down the street, a woman rolls down her window and yells at me, "Go ahead, my Black brother, I see you." Um, and it was moments like those that never happened in the places that I did my academic training. Um, um, and as I continued in my academic training, I very much was proud of the places that I was and believed that, I needed to go wherever I could to get the best academic training possible. And despite this, eventually, away from my community, I had a deep, very public fall. I had been out about my bipolar disorder before this. And so when I attempted suicide and was hospitalized, everyone seemed to know why I had been gone. Um, and in addition, now as someone who was considered a deeply mentally ill person, I no longer fit sort of the picture of what it looked like to be a successful physician in medicine. Um, and um, and yeah, I entered into a very challenging period of my life. Um, and uh, Eventually, I left the place that was very challenging for me. And one day I came back and I was just visiting some friends for a wedding. And as I walked down the street in this place where I had been before, I had a panic attack. And I'm not someone who historically had panic attacks. But I think the thing that I realized was that, I may have made it through medical training, through my residency training, but it came at a very immense, steep cost. when I returned to the city, my body kept the score. And I had done it because I wanted so badly to be a doctor. Um, but again, I still will sometimes ask myself the question, was it worth the cost? The second question that Dr. Anderson and I came to was, why does medical education sustain this purpose? And to answer this question, I want to introduce a construct called hegemony. Hegemony is a term which originated from a gentleman, Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian philosopher. He existed in the lineage of Karl Marx. And Karl Marx, he wrote about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, which are the members of society who have resources, and the commoner class, and talks about how the sort of wealthy ruling class of society are constantly extracting from the poor working class of society. Where Gramsci extends Karl Marx thinking is he says that hegemony is not just economic rule, but also intellectual rule by a dominant class. Gramsci says that we use education and schooling as a way of taking people from the non-ruling class who have intellectual promise, entering them into education. And even though the people who come from the commoners class and they think that they represent the place where they came from, simply by existing in education, we change them. We change the way they think. We change their beliefs. We change their actions. And they actually become more representative of the ruling class. And so hegemony is the interwoven economic and intellectual rule by a dominant group of people. And to demonstrate this, I have a story from Dr. Anderson. Those of us who have been extracted, we also extract. Many of you, anyone who holds a minoritized identity, women, people of color, people like disabled folks, et cetera, have likely heard the saying, you have to be twice as good to get half as far. And Dr. Anderson tells a story of how she worked in a program where she was supervising college students. And there was a student who came who was sent to her because they didn't follow the rules around attire in the workplace. And in Dr. Anderson's words, her t-shirt had some words on it, but they weren't remarkable or offensive to me. The student was immediately tearful, angry. I don't understand why this breaks the rule, she said. I explained that no language was allowed on clothing and that t-shirts were explicitly not allowed. Student says, some other students wear t-shirts. Why isn't it okay? She asked. I was unfazed. I said, because you have to understand that we are under the microscope. Everyone watches us. Everyone watches and waits for us to mess up because we are different. We have to be twice as good to get just as far. It's okay for those students who wear t-shirts sometimes. No one will really notice. It's not your fault. It's not fair. This is just how the world works. So one of the things from CSP that you will see that comes up recurrently is culturally sustaining pedagogy would not say that we should just sustain everything from any minoritized person just because of where they come from, but that we must critically evaluate each and every one of our actions and ask ourselves whether they are sustaining or extracting actions. What Dr. Anderson is showing here is she described, in the article before this, experiences around educators who thought that she was not safe to teach students who had the same disability that she did. And in that way, she is someone who had been extracted. And this story saying you have to be twice as good to get half as far is also a way that we extract people around us and hold them to standards that are not fair or possible or humane. I once had a participant in a research study that said, I want to do just as much to get just as far. And unfortunately, that's not the narrative that minority individuals give to other minorities. be it for a good reason or a nefarious reason. As we critically evaluate which aspects of our culture to sustain, we must take a deep inward look and sometimes face challenging truths about ourselves. So one aspect in so CSP originated in the early education literature. And one thing that CSP, one place that this came up is a lot of primary and secondary education literature talked about culturally responsive pedagogies and the ways that people could use things like rap to teach English. A CSP perspective, specifically towards rap, this has been raised in literature. There are many other things that we could critique, but would recognize that there's sometimes where rap can be misogynistic or homophobic. And so we shouldn't just accept, an art form blanketly in all of its, in all the ways that it exists for no reason without actually critically evaluating. So a story that relates to this was after my suicide attempt when I was in residency, I was out of work for 3 months, and my first month back was on a very challenging service in the liver transplant service. And historically, I mentioned like I with my mental health issues, anxiety was not something that I previously struggled with. But as I came back to work in this environment in which I had actually almost not been allowed to return to work, I felt very anxious. I felt like I was being watched, that if I made any mistakes, that I would be not allowed to, practice medicine anymore. And one day I made a mistake. And I didn't order a medication stat to get to a patient immediately. And for that reason, the medication was delayed. And there was a fellow who was supervising me was who clearly thought not well of me. And he would look over my shoulder and watch me as I did everything, even ordering very basic things that typically a late intern, someone would never watch them. I'm just kind of having a rough day and feeling kind of shitty. And over comes one of the surgical fellows who's also in the liver transplant service. And he says to me, what's wrong? I'm like, nothing, I'm fine. And then he stops me and he like really looks at me in the eye and says, Justin, what's wrong? And I remember in that moment just being in this very fragile place. And I didn't know what to say, but I sort of stumbled out that this other guy thinks I'm incompetent, and like I don't know, it just kind of sucks. And he basically looks at me again, stopping me, like looking me in my eye and says, Justin, like you're fine, you're doing fine. And for me, in a very fragile, post-suicidal, post-battle with my work state, being told that I was fine was actually very impactful. I appreciated that he didn't tell me like, you're doing great, everything's great, because like I wasn't doing great. But he basically said that I was okay. And I remember in that moment being shocked because I was surprised that this surgical fellow was the person who was like emotionally aware and connected with me, and that I expected the internists to be the people who are emotionally aware. I also remember being in this time where my mentality was, I just need to put my head down and grind harder. I can't ask for help. I just need to keep pushing. And in the piece, we critique both of those beliefs. One, this universal blanket statement that I've made about surgeons, that they're not emotionally, adept or aware or able to, help heal. And second, this belief that the method to when I'm struggling is to just put my head down and grind harder and harder and harder. Both of those things we would critique and not want to sustain in a culturally sustaining pedagogy. Years later, I sent him an email and just thanking him for what he had done. And I'll read it for you. He said, yes, of course I remember you. Thanks so much for your note. I'm so sorry to hear you are suffering, and I feel fortunate that my small gesture has such a positive impact. I lost a friend to suicide when I was in my early 20s, and I've always wondered how I could have helped. So thank you for sharing your experiences. On the other hand, I'm disappointed to hear that you hadn't experienced similar gestures from others in medicine. Your experiences are a good illustration about how we need to show compassion and care for those around us. Please be in touch if I can ever help with anything, and hopefully our paths will cross again soon. And I share this because just to highlight how much so many of us are touched by suicide and suicidality, even often in moments where we don't say it explicitly. And this person obviously had pain and hurt from this experience, but used it to sustain, to do something better. I have two more stories for you all. And this story is called "We Are So Excited to Have You." So this is Dr. Anderson. This is not her PhD. This is actually her getting an award at the ARA conference for a paper that she wrote. Because her words are so beautifully written, I will again read them for you because her words will do much better than what I can say. Conferences are a liminal space for me. Everything about conferences, dim meeting rooms, poor signage, inaccessible programs, isn't designed for me. Conferences are designed for people who can see, hear, and get around just fine. No one expects a disabled and deafblind attendee to come. From the grumbles of the staff, I usually get the feeling that no one really wants me to be there either. If I'm lucky, the organizing staff offer a limited set of disability accommodations. They say, "We have automated captioning. It's as accurate as professional captioners." It's not. "We have an app with a meeting program on it. It's accessible." It's not. "Can your caretakers guide you around the meeting?" Why do they assume I have a caretaker? In the end, I am left behind in hallways and lost in basements of hotels. I sit in rooms listening to a wash of dull sound while my colleagues freely speak, debate, and network. They share graphs and figures that I cannot see. They talk over each other, clamoring to ask each other questions I can't hear. I am there, but I'm not really there. I'm breathing the same air as them, but I have no access to the world they occupy. I had no reason to believe this conference would be any different, but almost as soon as I submitted the registration form, I received an email from the organizing staff. "Would you be willing to have a short meeting with us? We want to talk about what we can do to make this conference accessible. We are so excited to have you attend." I found myself in an unfamiliar situation. Accommodations were provided, of course. They listened to what I needed and provided it. No assumptions, no last-minute solutions, but they did more. They had guidelines for the conference attendees, for everyone, on how to speak, ask questions, and network in an accessible way. Not just for me, but also for those who had other kinds of bodies and minds. When I arrived at the conference, I was liberated from that liminal space. For the first time in my professional life, I asked questions of presenters. I knew what graphs were being shared. I could debate the key points and raise new ideas. I also learned accessibility habits that were new to me so that my colleagues could join me in that freedom. What could easily have been a set of accommodations for me alone became a living practice of 70 plus people all caring for each other. That conference taught me so much about myself and my inherent value. Once I had the tools and spaces that I needed, I could contribute the ideas I wanted to share. My value just needed to be seen. This experience also taught me that liberating and sustaining people, communities, and cultures is not an individual heroic effort, but a practice of somewhat unglamorous collective care. The final story that I want to share with you all is I shared in a piece which I called "These Ghoulish Hands, Bringing Our Whole Selves to Patient Care." And for me, this really sort of summarizes my relationship to thinking about CSP currently. Um, so this story happened actually a year to the day after I had been hospitalized as an intern. And I was covering the pager for some members of my team, and I get a page. And the page says, "Can you please order an as-needed sort of sedating medication for a patient? He keeps shouting and trying to hold my hand." And that was a very kind of strange page. And so I was like, this is a little bit weird. I'm gonna call back and see what is going on. And so I called back and I asked the nurse if they wanted me to come and see the patient, and they sort of said, and they said yes before I even finished. And so as I was walking across the Sky Bridge to see this patient, I looked him up in sort of the information I had on him. And it turns out that he was an elderly gentleman who had metastatic cancer, who was dying, who was on comfort care, who we thought would die in the next 24 hours. And as I get to the room, I see this gentleman, a gentleman who I call a ghoulish looking gentleman. You know, he has his body's wasted. You can see his clavicles. I'm not really sure if he's alert or open or knows that I'm in the room. But all I know is that he's shouting and his hand is like outstretched. And I walk into the room and I kind of crouch down next to him and I place my hand into his. And pretty immediately, as soon as I placed my hand into his, he stops yelling. And um, and as I am sitting there with him, there's some things that he's doing that are sort of beginning to transport me to a different place. Like he's kind of like firing his muscles as if he's sort of trying to like pump himself up for a race. And it's interesting because as I told this story to my therapist, he actually knew completely where I was going. And you know, he told me that when he saw me in the hospital right before I got urgently intubated, that I kind of did the same thing to try and like keep myself awake. Um, and um, and uh, uh, as I continued in this moment with him, I found myself transported back to the night that I tried to kill myself. And as I sort of laid on the ground, I remember saying to myself, like, Justin, it's okay. You're okay. And I was just trying to comfort myself in this very dark, painful time. Um, and you know, I found myself, and then you know, I sort of snapped back to the room, and I tried really hard. You know, I had done a lot of like therapy. We talked a lot about like mindfulness and being present to really force myself to like exist in the moment with this patient and to not go back to this dark time and just like be there with him. And I remember immediately recognizing that like what he was screaming or what he's yelling about is he's afraid that like, and even my experience, even in a moment when I wanted to die, dying was very scary. Um, and you know, I sort of like gently caressed his arm. And I would say I'm not really someone who's generally a very like affectionate person. And basically I sat and kind of held his hand. And despite the fact that I was covering like 60 patients, the pager was completely silent for like 30 minutes. And eventually the pager went off and I said to him, like, I'm sorry, I have to step out. And, you know, as I walked away, I was pretty certain that once I left the room, he was gonna start yelling again. And I closed the door and I waited outside the door. Um, and he never did. And 30 minutes later, I got a page that he had died. And I want to read you the sort of closing of what I wrote in this piece. Um, because, yeah, Mr. M had just attained something that I had wanted so badly before, death. And only because I lived was I able to share that intimate moment with him, to tell him that it was okay. I had never been so glad to be alive. By engaging in regular therapy and taking medication, my bipolar experience converts into assets for patient care, not liability. I believe that as medical professionals, we're often discouraged from leveraging those ghoulish parts of ourselves. Sometimes our darkest parts are also the most human and healing. Bipolar is my sun. Bipolar is my storm. There are only two things in life that are certain. Life will begin and life will end. I have learned that it does not always end happily. Regardless, it's okay. And as I reflect on Jack and Jack's story, and as I reflect on how much love Mr. and Mrs. Ruddell emanate, how much pride they have every single time they tell his story, They allow us to keep Jack's hands on each and every one of us. The last thing that I wanted to share was these two resources, both from someone named Marsha Linehan. She is the psychologist who is known for creating dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT. And I will say that I actually had DBT sort of forced on me at a time where I really didn't want it. And so I still recommend it, even despite the negative association that I have. She wrote this book called Building a Life Worth Living, which was not what I expected. It's actually her telling her story of living with borderline personality disorder and getting to the darkest depths of hell, and a commitment that she made to herself that if she were to ever get out, she would spend the rest of her life helping other people get out. And that's sort of the premise. And she sort of talks about how she came to understand or build this idea of DBT. And the last thing that I'll say is in this DBT handbook, this is a picture of mine because I couldn't find one online but this is one that's like on my bookshelf. There's an activity that I talk about during the podcast that I actually do really like, which is this. It's called breaking the chain, which is basically this idea that um, you know, something that was done with me in the psych hospital after attempting suicide. But you can do it with any sort of intense moment where there's sort of an outcome that you did something where you wish you hadn't, or that you could have done differently. And it basically says, starting from the first thing that happened, for Justin to attempt suicide, I first I made a decision in a moment because of some interaction that happened that I decided I was going to kill myself. And then I walked to the, wherever place that I was going to get to do whatever I was going to do, and each step, there's an opportunity for you to break the chain or to stop or to turn around, or to do something different to try and help de-escalate as opposed to further escalating. And yeah, I just think it's a cool, powerful tool. And, I, um, yeah, I am both very grateful to be alive today, and I also deeply understand the experience of not wanting to. And I just want to honor both of those as true and real and powerful, and not invalidate anyone's experience. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Justin. As always, the vulnerability that you share with all of us is so moving. And also, I think many of us will leave this talk and work to reflect on all of the things that you've said and think about how we navigate the world. But thank you for sharing so many personal sides. Um, I do want, for those of you who will be at Learn, Serve, Lead, I'll be there, Justin will be there, but really excitingly and importantly, Mr. and Mrs. Ruddell will be there on a panel with Stuart Slavin and Kelly Holder, and that is on the 2nd. And so I encourage you, if you're going to attend that panel, and then we'll be doing an interview afterwards to follow. I also want to let you know, as part of this speaker series, Docs with Disabilities is donating both to the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and to the Lorna Breen Foundation in honor of Jack Ruddell and in honor of Justin Bullock. We encourage you to utilize their resources, get involved. If you can and you have the ability to make a donation, that's wonderful. And finally, before I start moderating your questions, I just want to thank the University of Illinois College of Medicine, Department of Medical Education, who sponsors the DREAM Grand Rounds and make sure that everything is accessible for anyone who wants to engage in this series. And we're deeply, deeply grateful for them. So I encourage you to post questions in the Q&A. I also have a survey that I will put in the chat now, but you'll receive this in a letter afterwards. Mr. and Mrs. Ruddell, Justin, and I have put together a resource sheet for you, and you'll be getting, everyone who's registered will be getting that in the email. It's a wonderful resource to just have. So if you are interacting with learners or someone asks you about the best resources in the space, you have that available to you. So we're going to move on to questions, and we have a question from an anonymous attendee. Um, is your story through medical education, medical school, residency, fellowship changed your view on why you want to become a physician before you started medical? Has changed from when you first started medical school? And if so, how did it change? And how do you look at this? How did it stay the same?
I think that I have two. I have sort of a split answer. So one answer is the more resistance I faced around, you know, being pushed back around having like serious mental illness and existing medicine, the more that makes me want to be in medicine. More it makes me want to fight and push back um, um, and um, and still, apologies, my headphones are doing a lot of weird things. Sorry. Sorry. The second part, I guess I would say to this is there was a point when I've been sort of deep, really struggling, where I was fighting about getting back to work, where I actually had to come to a place that I came to this acceptance that even if I never got to return to medicine, that I would still be Justin and that I could still try and heal and help people and do good in the world and all these things. And I'll say, like, I spend most of my life not in that place. And I think that like I would say that I would have rather died than not be a doctor. And I actually feel liberated from, I don't feel that way anymore. I love being a doctor, but I'm still, but yeah, fine, holding the me, separating the me from not letting the doctor be my entire identity, I think has been one of the things that's helped me to like actually ask for help and step away when I've needed. Yeah.
Thank you. And Mr. and Mrs. Ruddell, we're coming up, as you mentioned, on the 5-year anniversary of losing Jack. And in what ways have you gotten involved in trying to be part of the change? And in what ways has that changed your perspective on medical education?
As we tried to find our way and our path forward and context and meaning, it became very clear to us that we needed to be focused on telling Jack's story and honoring Jack, but also the message and the need that comes from the lessons learned. And so that has guided us. And as a parallel to that, we're guided, frankly, by what we know Jack would do. Jack was very conscientious. He was very, very strong and very principled. And we feel, in a way, we're hoping to do what he would do for him and with him. In terms of our involvement, I think that you mentioned podcasts, which have just been a wonderful gift to us, yes, which we co-produced with you and with Docs with Disabilities. And that was an exercise for us that was very difficult, but it was one that I think not only helped others, hopefully, but it helped us in terms of processing and really gaining an understanding, perspective that was important for our grief recovery, although we will never recover. So I think that the podcast, the paper that we were able to write. The opportunities to do things like this are things that we feel are very important, and not only to honor Jack, but to help others, to
That's called for a change.
call for a change, and to
Call for
really do
support.
our part to really help push for a cultural change in medical education.
Thank you so much. And for those that don't know, John and Jennifer did a series along with myself and Justin, and many other professionals and researchers, including Stuart Savin, that weaved their story through the research, literature, best practice that we know to date. And it was episodes 102 to 107. And we'll have a follow-up coming soon, December or January. And then also, Mr. and Mrs. Ruddell wrote an exceptional commentary that was published in JAMA IM. And there was I've never seen this before, but there was a commentary to the commentary by Dr. Lottie Derby that was pretty powerful as well. Those are all listed in um, the resource sheet. I hope you have an opportunity to see all of the wonderful comments to all of you, Justin, to you, Mr. and Mrs. Riddell, to you, and all the love that is in the chat, and we'll capture that for you so you don't miss any of that. A few more questions are coming in, and thank you all so much. Um, ah, the question is for you, Justin, and it's about advocacy. How do you advocate for yourself in the work environment now? What does that look like? How did you navigate the process of finding a new job in a right place and disclosing your disability? And I hope you'll also talk about your episode that just published, I think, a week ago.
Mhm. This is a great question because literally the like 30 minutes before I logged on here, I was actually talking with my new sort of boss section head about my bipolar and us sort of planning and like what to, like us talking through a plan together of. So the first thing is when I have a new job, I'm someone who I feel comfortable sharing about my bipolar disorder. In part because I've written about it a lot and it's kind of like out there and it's I can't really not like the yeah, people know. Um but, so one of the things that was really important, I had a very positive experience in fellowship after having a negative experience in residency. And even though I stayed at the same place, I have a slightly different boss. Like my program director is no longer my boss. I now have a different person. And it's someone who I trust and think very highly of and all these things. And still, we sat down today because I was like, I just want to like talk through like a plan for what we'll do if you're worried about me or if I'm not doing well, like who like because for me it's like the first person who I hope gets talked to is me, and I tend to be very open about how I'm doing, and I'm very historically I've always been happy for my providers to interface with other people if they need to, and sort of just like talking through it before stuff gets bad. Because I think part of the reason why things went bad, I think most people in medicine are not like evil, malicious people. But I think sometimes people don't know what to do, and their response when they don't know what to do is just to squeeze as tight as possible. And that can actually be really harmful, especially when they don't know when they're in a space that they don't know what to do. Um, so yeah, I think like so. I mean, there's like sort of broader advocacy, but I think the first thing for me is just like finding like making my like space in the sandbox like flat and like okay for me to exist in, and then I can like try and venture out and do all these other things. So I think that's sort of what I would say is for me the most important thing right now.
Wonderful. Well, any last words? We're at time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Any last thoughts for our audience? And this is recorded. This will be available on our YouTube page, and you will, as a registrant, get a link to this.
If I could just say one thing, which is um, I find myself just like really moved today by Mr. and Mrs. Ruddell. And like I'm like on the edge of crying the whole like this like whole like for a really long time.
I'm
And
over
it's
here
just because
crying,
of
like off the edge.
and it's just because of like, and I understand why people have different reasons, but like sometimes someone dies by suicide and it's a very shameful thing and people don't talk about their like loved ones, and it's just like to me just so beautiful that you all like do. And I like, yeah, it is, it's healing. And yeah, and that is amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, it's healing for us to talk about it and to share.
Yeah.
It is. And we really appreciate, Justin, your very personal story and the way that you share it in your vulnerability. It is so powerful and reaffirming um, to us to hear and to so many others that are at risk of being in that place. And you have something very special, and the fact that you share it so widely is remarkable, and it's a gift to us all. So thank you for your comments today, for again being part of who we are and sharing Jack's story, and all for the betterment of others that are coming forward. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you all so much. And we will continue this conversation on another episode of the podcast. And please do read those articles. And if you are at LSL, please go and see the panel with the Ruddells, and you'll get much more context there. So thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you.